In April 2003, I met for the first time someone who had lost his mind's eye, the ability to visualize. Jim Campbell was a delightful, highly articulate surveyor in his mid-60s who had relished his visual imaginings of friends and family, favorite places, and past holidays. Previously, when he opened a novel, he had entered a richly visual world. If he lost his keys, he would try to call to mind an image of their last location. But, abruptly, after a cardiac procedure, he found himself bereft of imagery. Although his everyday vision was perfectly normal, he told me expressively, "I miss being able to see." Close your eyes for a moment. Can you picture an apple? Maybe it's red and shiny, maybe green and crisp. Can you almost taste it, hear the crunch as you bite in? Now, imagine if you couldn't picture it at all. For some people, imagination comes in dazzling technicolour. For others, it's silent and dark. And for all of us, imagination is the hidden stage on which so much of life plays out. Welcome to Leafing Through Science, where we dive into the pages of popular books in the life sciences with the writers who made them happen, from new releases to timeless classics. I'm your host, Hedi Young, and today I'm joined by Adam Zeman, neurologist, writer, and researcher in the science of imagination. Published this year, his book, The Shape of Things Unseen, gives us a fascinating journey into the world of imagination, drawing on the latest research from neuroscience, psychology, and beyond. Adam grew up in London and trained in medicine at Oxford after a first degree in philosophy and psychology, and went on to specialize in cognitive and behavioral neurology, including the neurological disorders of sleep. He is now Professor of Cognitive and Behavioral Neurology at the University of Exeter, and his research focuses on disorders of visual imagery and memory. And he's also written widely on the science and philosophy of consciousness. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thanks very much for having me, Hedi.
Now, we tend to think of imagination as something reserved for artists, writers, or dreamers. But the truth is, imagination isn't the exception in our daily lives, it's our default setting. In our conversation, we'll explore what imagination is, how it can help us and sometimes harm us, and what it means to live at the extremes of imagination, from those who can't picture anything at all to those whose inner worlds are overwhelmingly vivid. We'll be exploring everything from the imaginary companions of childhood, which help us learn to understand other minds, to the prevalence of our inner voice, and even the many healthy people who hear voices that seem external, but are actually their own. We'll look at what's happening in the brain when we imagine, how scientists can now measure the vividness of our inner worlds, and how imagination can be powerful enough to literally stop someone in their tracks in functional disorders. We'll see how playing computer games can help tackle painful images and post-traumatic stress, and how simply rehearsing in the mind can make your little finger stronger. And along the way, we'll reveal just how extensive our mind wandering really is. So, if your mind happens to wander while you're listening to this episode, don't worry, you'll be staying right on topic. So, Adam, maybe we can start by pinning down exactly what we mean by imagination and what its properties are.
Surely. Well, you've given a very lucid introduction. So the sense of imagination which I had in mind when I was writing this book, the kind of overarching sense, is the capacity that allows us to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual worlds that are created by artists and by scientists. The reason I wanted to use that broad sense was that it struck me some couple of decades ago that one of the most extraordinary things about us is that we lead so much of our lives in our heads. So that's the overarching sense I had in mind. But I think it's worth pausing and teasing out three particular senses of imagination because it's a very tricky term. It's not a term of science. It's a rich, ambiguous word. So the first sense is, I think, not a very colloquial one, but you could say that somebody is using imagination when they form an image of the world around them. So we do speak of a retinal image or a perceptual image. Psychologists will use those terms when they're describing your experience of the world, the here and now, as you are perceiving it. And the fact that we use the word reminds us that perception is a creative act, and that's perhaps something that we'll have a chance to come on to talk about later, because that's one of the key ideas in the book. So not a very colloquial sense, but it is one sense in which we certainly use the word image. We are more prone to use the word imagination in a second sense. You used it in your introduction, when we call to mind things in their absence. So imagining that apple in its absence, or your front door, or the face of your spouse. And we are pretty good at calling to mind the sensory characteristics of things which are not present to us. And that has been called by psychologists reproductive imagination, because you are calling to mind the way things seem to us when we perceive them. And most of us can do that to some degree. Imagination in that sense is a kind of echo of perception. It's a weak echo of perception. So when I visualize my front door, I can more or less see it, but I don't see it in the detail and with the vivacity I would if I was standing before it and looking at it. And then there's a third sense of imagination, which has to do with reconceiving and reconfiguring the world. So it has to do with creativity, bringing into being things which are both new and useful, which is the standard definition of creativity, or creating effective surprise, as our psychologists put it. Now, it's interesting that we use the term imagination to refer to the capacity that underlies creativity, because, of course, creativity doesn't always involve or require sensory imagery, second sense of imagination, but it often does. The broad, overarching sense I've had in mind in writing the book is this capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now, to live in our heads, which we do for much of the time. But it's helpful, I think, to bear in mind that there are a number of more specific senses, and I've distinguished one relating to the perceptual image, one relating to the image of things in their absence, reproductive imagination, and one relating to creativity, which psychologists have sometimes called productive imagination.
And this mental image formation appears to me multimodal. So when we imagine a holiday at the beach, we see the waves, hear the seagulls, feel the sun on our skin.
Absolutely. So I've probably been talking in visual terms because vision is, for most of us, the dominant sense. But exactly as you describe, many of us can hear the sound of thunder in our mind's ear. Imagine the feel of velvet or of silk with our mind's fingertip. The mind's nose and the mind's tongue offer what are for many people more elusive forms of imagery, but some people claim, and I'm sure it's true, that they can imagine smells and imagine tastes. And certainly we can imagine kinesthetically, so you can imagine running for a bus.
In emotions, the imagination also has a role to play there, picturing the faces of loved ones or replaying meaningful memories in the mind's eye.
Yes, so emotion is often integrated into our imagery. And of course, our emotional lives involve imaginative acts. So when you read the expression on someone's face, you are performing an empathic act, which involves a kind of imagination. You have to go beyond the facial appearance to infer an emotional state. And when you do that, just as we activate visual regions of the brain when we visualize something in its absence, so we activate the regions of our brain which become active when we experience emotion to read the emotion in someone else's face. So if you look at the face of somebody who's happy or sad or disgusted, areas that would become active when you experience happiness or sadness or disgust become active in your brain.
So the common thread to all these qualities seems to be that the imagination allows us to represent what is not or may not be present in the here and now, whether that's images, emotions, memories, or futures that don't yet exist. So already in defining the imagination, we have clues as to why we imagine in the first place. It's not just idle daydreaming and castles in the sky. It's actually doing a lot of work for us.
It is indeed. It's doing work of a variety of different kinds. I'll start with the third form of imagination I mentioned, imagination that underpins our creativity. We are profoundly cultural creatures. Our lives from moment to moment are permeated by culture. So we're using language at the moment, we're wearing clothes, we're employing all kinds of technology to communicate with one another. And of course, culture is the outcome of individual acts of creativity. You can trace every one of the tools that we're using or words that we're speaking back to individual human acts of creativity underpinned by imagination. So it's fundamental to our human lives for that reason. Imagination in the second sense that I described, the reproductive imagination, is important to us in a variety of ways. It underpins memory to some degree. If you recollect a day you spent on holiday last year, it's very likely that visualization is going to be an important part of your recollection. And it seems to play an important part in emotion. Imagery has been described as an emotional amplifier. We tend to have a much stronger gut response to imagined events or recollected events if we visualize them, if we engage sensory imagery, than if we simply read a description and don't engage sensory imagery. And then it plays a role in creativity, harking back to what I was just saying about the role of imagination and creativity in our lives as cultural beings. But many creative people describe using sensory imagery in their thinking. So, for example, Einstein was a highly visual thinker. He said he very, very rarely used language. He tended to use images in his thought experiments. But it's not true of everyone. As I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, I've been studying for the last decade or so people who lack sensory imagery, but who nevertheless can be highly creative, productive folk. So it seems that imagination in that creative sense doesn't require imagery, but it often makes use of it.
And you mentioned memory. That's one of the places where imagery seems to really matter. There's even a group of people with unusually poor autobiographical memory, despite being perfectly normal or even above average in other ways. They often show reduced visual memory and sometimes no visual memory at all. But memory didn't evolve just so we could look back at the past. Perhaps its real value lies in helping us anticipate the future. And as you write, as Lewis Carroll's White Queen exclaims, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. And it seems that people who struggle to remember the past often find it just as hard to imagine the future.
There's plenty of work from the last 20 years or so speaking to that. So it turns out that people who become amnesic because of damage to the brain, which prevents them from laying down new memories, also have difficulty in imagining the future. And that reflects another neurological observation, which is that when we recollect past events, we engage similar brain areas to those that become active when we anticipate future events. So recollection and imagination are indeed bound up. And people with aphantasia, people who lack sensory imagery, who we'll probably come on to discuss, tend to have a rather thin memory for their personal past. So they have a factual memory, they know what happened and when, but they can't relive experiences in the way in which many of us can.
I have a friend who doesn't have much visual imagery, and he often says that he struggles to remember movies that he's seen.
Yeah, so actually a recurring anecdote told to me by people with aphantasia, that's people who lack sensory imagery, particularly visual imagery, is that they never have that experience that many people have of going to the cinema and seeing the film of a book you've read and feeling that character didn't look at all the way I'd imagined him. That doesn't happen to people with aphantasia.
Interestingly, more than half of children under the age of 7 will at some point have an imaginary companion. And it seems to me to be a bit like lion cubs play fighting. On the surface, it looks like innocent fun, but really it's training for survival, practicing hunting techniques, improving coordination, and strengthening social bonds. In the same way, children's pretend play and imaginary companions may not be innocent fun either, but a kind of practice for one of the most important human skills, understanding other minds, which helps us navigate our complex social world.
So I think you're absolutely right. Our capacity for theory of mind, our capacity to enter into one another's experience, perceive the world somewhat differently to ourselves, that's absolutely fundamental to our day-to-day lives and our social interactions with others. And I think it's also fundamental to a particular characteristic of the human imagination, which is our ability to share our imagined lives with one another. Probably many animals enjoy some imaginative experience. So if you watch a dog lying on a mat after a long walk, clearly in dream sleep, it may well be that the dog has a dream experience somewhat of the same kind as you or I have when we sleep and dream. What I think no other animal on Earth is able to do, and we can do in spades, is to share our imaginative experience with one another. And that depends on a capacity for mind sharing, which comes online extraordinarily early in our human lives. Infants as young as a couple of months old engage in very intimate dialogues with their parents, typically with their mother, but it can be with mother or father, in which they exchange conversation in a kind of musical way, taking turns, clearly intensely engaged with one another. And that kind of sharing of attention then develops over the course of the first year of life in such a way that attention begins to turn out on the world, and mother and baby direct their attention to something like a toy that's in front of them, each aware that the other is paying attention to it. And that then underpins the ability to begin to refer to things in the world, perhaps initially using a gesture, but it's easy to see how words become bearers of meaning in the context of shared attention between parent and baby. And it's through the possession of language that we become able to control what we imagine and to share what we imagine. And that in turn depends ultimately on this kind of mind sharing ability, which is apparent very early in the lives of infants. And this is, I think, a distinctive human evolutionary characteristic. We don't see shared attention of quite this kind evolving in quite this way in any other species.
Parents actually sometimes worry that these invisible playmates that we have as children are a sign of loneliness. But in fact, the opposite seems to be true. Research shows that children with imaginary companions tend to be more sociable and creative, and they develop an understanding of other people's minds earlier than their peers.
Yes, that's right. Imaginative play seems to facilitate social development, and it may anticipate our enjoyment of creative fiction.
Yeah, because I guess
Yeah,
part of the appeal of the books and movies we enjoy is that they satisfy this need to understand how other people's minds tick.
absolutely.
And what's perhaps surprising is that we don't really talk more about this vast inner landscape we all have and where we spend so much of our time. Most of us just assume everyone else imagines in the same way we do, but in reality, there's a huge range of experiences. For example, you mentioned a violinist who told you that she always has a tune playing in her head, which makes my own feel pretty quiet.
Yes, there seems to be huge inter-individual variation. So, for example, people vary in the extent to which they experience inner speech. Some people say that their mind is very rarely without a monologue or sometimes a dialogue. Others find it hard to identify any inner speech in their experience. Over the last 20 years, I've studied people who say that they have no sensory imagery whatsoever. They can't imagine the face of a friend or a loved one. They can't hear anything in their mind's ear, touch anything with their mind's fingertip. We've described these people as being aphantasic. There are, by contrast, people who say that their imagery is as vivid as real seeing. So, yes, there's a wide variety in the content of people's imagery. It relates to two things, I think. It relates probably to a biological predisposition. So I suspect that in the case of people with aphantasia, there may often be some biological obstacle to enjoying sensory imagery. But I think it also relates to training. So musicians, for example, are people who've trained their brains to respond to and generate musical sound. And not surprisingly, that's what their mind is continually full of.
And we see this variability in the way that we perform tasks. For example, if you show someone a few objects on the table and then cover them with a cloth, they might picture them afterwards to help recall the objects, or they might just rely on remembering their names. And experiments suggest that both strategies are in play and that people differ a lot in which they lean on.
Yeah, absolutely. In that particular case, most of us use a combination of them. There seem to be people who rely exclusively on one or the other.
And this variability shows up in sleep too. For some, dreams are strikingly vivid, while others rarely recall them, and a few can even control their dreams lucidly.
That's right. People with aphantasia, they invariably lack imagery during the day. That's the nature of aphantasia. But most of them enjoy some imagery in their dreams. But a little less than a half describe interesting atypical forms of dreaming, or no dreaming at all. The interesting atypical forms of dreaming include, for example, dreaming in emotion or kinesthetically, dreaming motion, or having a narrative dream, which has a kind of storyline, but no imagery. So dream content is variable. Fascinating dissociation between the absence of wakeful imagery and the presence of dream imagery in people with aphantasia, probably explained by the fact that wakeful imagery is often voluntary. So if I ask you to call to mind an apple, you're going to have to perform a very deliberate, top-down psychological act, whereas dreams are more bottom-up. They're not driven by conscious decisions. They're driven by activity deep in the brain stem, in limbic regions associated with emotion. So that's probably the reason why these two forms of imagery can dissociate. I'm sure that in both cases, the experience of imagery involves activity in sensory areas, but you can generate that activity in very different ways.
And in your book, you draw a distinction between the images that appear as we're drifting off to sleep, which I believe are properly referred to as hypnagogic states. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And the
Hypnagogic, yeah,
images
yeah.
and the images we experience in our actual dreams.
Indeed. Just as you begin to drop off to sleep, people often experience hypnagogic imagery. That can be simple, geometric imagery, patterns, spirals, lattices, which may actually well reflect our experience of the kind of structure of the visual cortex. But people also sometimes experience formed imagery at those times. They may see faces. People sometimes see much more elaborate images. I have a friend who described once seeing a kind of medieval procession, which he could examine in extraordinary detail. There's a fascinating kind of release of imagery at the point at which people are dropping off to sleep, presumably as various networks within the brain are dissociating from one another. Kind of executive network, which normally controls our thought and behavior, is losing its grip at the kind of spontaneous discharges of the visual system.
And one way in which these images that come to us as we're falling asleep differentiate from actual dreams is that they appear to lack this sense of the self, the narrative self, this idea that we are a part of our dreams in actual dreams. And instead, we're more of a spectator.
That's exactly right. You watch images pass before you, but you don't typically feel emotionally engaged. You're not the actor in a drama, which you become in dream sleep.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
fascinating distinction, which had never really crossed my mind before. Now, if it feels like our minds are wandering all the time, that's because they actually are. One of the striking findings you write about is just how much of our lives we spend in this drifting state, whether it's replaying a memory, planning tomorrow's dinner, or daydreaming about something we'd like to happen. For example, there was that 2010 science study from Harvard where people were pinged on their iPhones throughout the day. Could you tell us what it revealed?
It's really rather remarkable. It shows that we spend a minimum of a third of our time, 30% of our time, daydreaming in whatever activity you choose, except making love. That's the one activity in which people seem to be reliably in the here and now. But doing just about anything else, you spend between 38% and about 50% of your time mind wandering. I think this speaks to the fact that we generally live much of our lives in our heads. Even when we're not mind wandering, we are often deliberately recollecting the past or thinking about what we'll be doing in the future, or absorbed by a novel or lost in a film. Corresponding to this observation, there's work using descriptive experience sampling showing that awareness of our immediate surroundings is actually not the most common conscious content. You might assume that most of the time we're interacting with our surroundings, and then just occasionally we get lost in our thoughts. But as you imply, it's actually the other way around. And the most common conscious content is imagery, more common than awareness of immediate surroundings. This is based on work initiated by somebody called Russell Hurlbut in the States, now probably getting on for 50 years ago, in which you probe experience by activating a buzzer of some kind. Somebody gets a signal which tells them to report what is in their mind at this particular moment. Yeah.
Just before we get to Russ Hurlbut's studies, you mentioned that lovemaking was the only activity in which mind wandering was minimally present. And I wonder whether skydiving was one of the activities they tested, because I'm guessing jumping out of a plane probably reduces mind wandering as well. And it does make you
Yes.
wonder whether part of the appeal of many of the things we like to do, chasing new experiences, pushing ourselves with intense exercise, losing ourselves in a video game, or even mind-altering drugs, is really about escaping our inner worlds for a while and
Yeah.
recapturing the immediacy of the here and now.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think there's a tension, isn't there, in our human lives between the desire on the one hand to be in the here and now, to be experiencing the present with a kind of vivacity which often gets rubbed away by daily grind of our lives. So we lose our sense of wonder and beauty at the here and now, and sometimes we want to have that restored. But on the other hand, there's a very human drive to lose ourselves in our thoughts. That is, after all, what I think is most distinctive about us, that we have this capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now. It's Janus-faced. It allows us to be creative, call to mind the faces of family and friends, but of course it can be a curse, as when we become lost in the ruminations of depression or subjected to the intrusive imagery which occurs in post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of us spend our lives oscillating between the pursuit of the immediate, the wish to rekindle our pleasure in the here and now, and our enjoyment of the imagined. I wouldn't want to urge one or other on anyone. I think we need our share of both.
And you mentioned Russ Hurlbut there, and work shows that inner speech, not just mind wandering, is surprisingly common as well. Could you
Yeah.
talk to us about what researcher Russ Hurlbut's experiments have revealed about our inner voices?
Yeah, he's revealed considerable variability. And when I began to read and think about this, I kind of looked into my own mind, and I found it very difficult actually to identify much in the way of inner speech. But then, with a bit of further introspection and efforts to kind of catch my mind in action, I realized that I was sometimes articulating a sentence or hearing the chuckle of an old friend. There was certainly some auditory content there. The work by Russ and colleagues, including Charles Fernyhough in Durham, who's done very interesting work on inner speech over the last couple of decades, shows that most people experience inner speech regularly. It doesn't tend to dominate inner life, but it's often present. It is experienced as if it were being produced rather than heard. So it's in a way more of a kind of motoric echo than an auditory echo. And people vary greatly in the ways in which they make use of it. Some people feel that it's indispensable to their thinking, others don't. So there were examples of people for whom it was a wall-to-wall phenomenon present in their inner experience constantly, and others who experienced none. But for most of us, it's an element of our inner life.
It usually takes the form of full sentences, echoing the same
Yeah,
inflections we'd use out
yeah,
loud, and
yeah,
directed either to oneself or to people we imagine.
yep, can be either.
Another fascinating area your book touches on is voice hearing. About 1 in 10 of us will, at some point, hear a voice that seems to come from outside, but is actually self generated. And for around 1 in 100, it happens regularly, so called healthy voice hearers.
That's right. Hearing voices is, of course, often associated with psychosis. It occurs in schizophrenia, in which the voices tend to be derogatory and are often addressing the hearer in the third person. But there's a substantial group of people, at least as many as suffer from schizophrenia, who hear voices without any associated mental illness. They tend to be more benign, sometimes attributed to an external source and sometimes not. And it seems that in both cases, the origin of the experienced voice is activity in auditory regions of the brain. One suggestion in the context of schizophrenia has been that there's a misattribution of internally generated speech, which comes to activate auditory areas more strongly than it normally would, so that the voice is perceived as if it were generated externally. And that might relate to a difficulty in schizophrenia in identifying self-generated action more widely. As you said, a high proportion of us will, at one time or another, hear a voice fleetingly, which appears to come from outside. That's quite common, for example, in hypnagogic imagery. So we didn't mention this, but as people are drifting off to sleep, they may see things, but they may also hear things. It's not unusual to hear a knock on the door or hear your voice being called. There are a number of other interesting contexts in which people hear voices in ways that sometimes can be productive. So novelists sometimes describe hearing their characters speak, and that can help in the development of the plot and narrative of their work.
And it's interesting that healthy voice hearers often don't find these voices distressing at all. I believe some of them sometimes attribute them to a benign external source, sometimes
Oh,
a divine one. And given
yeah.
that some voice hearers attribute these experiences to a divine source, it raises the question of whether inner voices have played a role in religious experiences too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems likely, doesn't it, that imagery of various kinds has played a part in spiritual experience. Perhaps we should take a step back and remind ourselves that our moment-to-moment experience of the world, so all our perceptual experience, is generative. So it's easy to assume that what we perceive is a simple kind of readout of information that's coming to us from the world. But we know, for a whole variety of reasons, that that's not the case. There's the phenomenon of pareidolia. So if you see a face in the moon, you're clearly seeing something that isn't there, that reflects your brain's pattern-seeking impulses. Your brain, without your conscious intervention, your brain is configuring an unface-like set of features in such a way that you see a face there. Illusions provide another example. For example, the size-distance illusion. In the book, I reproduced an image of somebody crossing a bridge. 3 images of the same size at different distances look as if they're different sizes because your brain makes an unconscious correction for distance. Let me give you the most dramatic example from my own experience. When I was a teenager, I woke one night to see a burglar standing at the foot of my bed. And I was so convinced of the reality of this figure that I shouted at him. And then over the next few seconds, the stripy football shirt of the burglar dissolved into a pattern of light and dark created by a slatted fence that had light shining through it. I failed to draw the curtains of my room.
Must have been pretty terrifying.
Yeah, so that was very terrifying. So experience is generative. And in a sense, the world we experience is as it's been described, a controlled hallucination. Experience is more inside out than it is outside in. So once you appreciate that our moment-to-moment perceptual experience is generative, then it becomes much easier to understand how people can have experiences in which they mistake their inner world for reality. So that was what happened when I perceived the burglar standing at the foot of my bed. This experience was clearly entirely internally generated. So not surprising that we should be deceived sometimes about whether something is real or coming from inside our heads. Visionary experience is common, and I think it's very likely that visionary experience has entered into the lives of religious people and influenced their spiritual experiences and played an important part in shaping their beliefs.
This, of course, brings us to the topic of how we imagine. How does the brain go about the business of imagining? And as you say, one of the important points you make in the book is that even perception itself is partly imaginative. And this is something I discussed with Anil Seth in our episode a few months ago on consciousness and perception. The idea is that the brain isn't just reacting passively to what comes through our eyes and ears, it's actively generating models of the world to help us perceive it. And our imagination can then run these models offline so that we can not just perceive the world, but imagine it too, and represent things in their absence. And if the idea of the brain as an organ of prediction is correct, then imagination, as you put it, is perception's next door neighbor.
So yes, it seems, as we were discussing earlier, that when we visualize or hear something in our mind's ear, regions of the brain which would become active when we see and when we hear become active. This is true of the other senses. It's true also of our kinesthetic imagery. So if you imagine running for a bus, you will activate motor regions similar, not identical to, but similar to those which would become active if you actually were running. And it seems very generally that there's an unexpected degree of considerable overlap between brain regions that become active when you are doing something or perceiving something, and brain regions that become active when you are imagining it or remembering it. There isn't a kind of segregation in the brain as we might have thought between regions involved in perception, action, imagination. They're very much intermingled with one another. And in imagination, we do indeed run offline systems in the brain which become active when we are perceiving, acting, emoting.
And since we were talking about how common hallucinations are, another fascinating study that illustrates the predictive brain in action, one you mentioned in your book from a few years ago, shows that hallucinations can actually be conditioned in almost anyone. If people learn to expect a faint sound after a flash of light, they'll eventually start hearing the sound even when it isn't there. So prior experience alone can be enough to trigger hallucinations in healthy people. And
absolutely, yeah.
We've been talking about mind wandering, and researchers have identified a brain network that becomes especially active when we're at rest, a network that turns out to be deeply tied to the imagination.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most fascinating and rather unsung discoveries in neuroscience over the last 20 years or so. And I think it helps to make the brain a much more conducive place to the human self than it seemed, certainly when I started in neurology. Going back to the beginning of this story, about 20 years ago, people began to look at what happens in the resting brain. Taking a step further back, perhaps I should explain that brain imaging, functional brain imaging, which is used in this work, really relies on the fact that brain is in some ways like muscle. So if you work an area of your brain in some particular task, the blood flow to it will increase. And it's possible to visualize that increase in blood flow using a variety of techniques, but currently, most often, using what is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is sensitive to the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood in any given brain region. And it turns out that if you just ask someone to lie in a brain scanner and chill, there's one particular network of regions which is more active in the resting brain than in the typically working brain. And this set of regions has come to be known as the default mode network because it's active, if you like, by default. It turns out that the function of the default mode network is to recollect the past, to anticipate the future, to think about other minds, and to think about moral decisions. So really, its functions pretty well correspond with the kinds of things we do when we daydream. You might be thinking about something interesting that happened to you yesterday, or some plan for tomorrow, or somebody who's offended you recently, or some difficulty you have in your life which you're trying to resolve. It's something of a caricature, but not too much of a caricature to describe it as a daydreaming network. And it has an interesting anti-correlation with what's been called the cognitive control or executive network. So if you're given a challenge, if I ask you to tell me as many words as you can, beginning with the letter P, you'll have to engage that cognitive control network. The default network will shut down, whereas when the default mode network is active and you're lost in your daydream, the executive network will be relatively inactive. Interestingly, there is some evidence that in creative work, these two networks enter into a more harmonious relationship than usual, which corresponds to the descriptions that creative people giving of entering a state in which they feel, as one songwriter I spoke to said, they feel more objective and subjective at the same time than they can usually be. They can lower a bucket down into the well of their memory and experience, but at the same time they can examine what emerges in a critical way and harmonize their critical and creative faculties. So yes, the default mode network is a fascinating discovery, and I think the work on resting state networks generally speaks to the dynamism, spontaneity, autonomy of the brain, which is quite a far cry from the kind of computer analogy that was used for a long time, and harmonizes much better with our experience of ourselves as dynamic, autonomous beings, and also helps to make sense of creativity, particularly the unconscious component to creativity.
So when we have a mind pop, for example, that's likely involving the DMN. When a thought suddenly appears in our consciousness that is not present in the world, in the here and now.
It's likely that it is. And there are now other interesting examples of spontaneous processes in the brain, which I think help to explain our autonomy and the brain's autonomy. The phenomenon of replay is a fascinating one. This was initially described in animals, but something very similar seems to occur in the human brain. If you explore a new environment, just go for a walk in a new place, a series of cells in your hippocampus will become active in a particular sequence. So the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain deep in the temporal lobe, very important in acquiring new memories, but which also maps space. So if you go for a walk, a sequence of cells will become active in the hippocampus, which maps the environment. So that's interesting in itself. But it turns out that when you rest and sleep after this walk, the same cells will replay in the same sequence. So there is a replay of experience, if you like. And probably most of the time, this is an unconscious replay, but it may occasionally pop into consciousness, give rise to a mind pop. Replay sounds like a somewhat passive process, passive in the sense that it's being driven by your immediate past experience. But there is evidence that replay isn't always so slavish. So sometimes if you see a series of images that don't quite make sense in the order in which you were exposed to them, the process of replay may reorder them in a more sensible fashion. So you can see how it might contribute to processes of creativity. Another example of spontaneous creative processes comes from studies of insight. The creative process typically is said to involve a sequence of stages: preparation, where you're kind of working out what your problem is, incubation while your brain is working on it, and then illumination or insight. And there are some experimental ways of studying insight. There is the remote associates test, in which you get asked, for example, what single word links pine, tree, and source. And generally people have to kind of agonize over that and eventually will come up with a solution. But just once in a while, the word apple will pop into somebody's mind. Pineapple, apple tree, apple sauce. And it turns out that when that happens, you get a distinctive burst of fast electric activity coming from the right temporal lobe. That's interesting because language is mainly represented on the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain does have some access to language, but the right temporal lobe represents the meanings of words rather loosely. So you can see how loosely associated meaning could be helpful to you in solving a task of that kind. And we're beginning to get some insight into what happens in those moments of illumination, which by definition are difficult to study experimentally from work like that. So yeah, a whole series of examples of work which reveals the autonomous dynamic activity of the brain, helping to make sense of the kind of spontaneous element in our experience generally, but in creativity in particular.
Well, that brings this episode to an end, but in part 2, you'll learn how you can easily score yourself on the vividness of your own mental imagery and discover how scientists are finding ever more ingenious ways to measure it, including experiments where simply imagining sunlight can make your pupils constrict. We'll also explore what happens when imagination goes awry, from using video games to weaken intrusive images and mental disorders, to how the brain's expectations and emotions can produce real physical symptoms, even paralysis and functional neurological disorder. And we'll see how the power of imagination can be harnessed, how mentally rehearsing actions can boost performance for musicians, surgeons, and athletes, and even increase physical strength. Finally, we'll meet people living at the extremes of imagination, from aphantasia to hyperphantasia. So stay tuned for part 2 and see you then.